Good afternoon. Protesters aiming to stop the demolition of an eco-house in Pembrokeshire have set up camp in the national park. Tony Wrench, who's been involved in a planning row with the authorities for years, had been due to demolish his roundhouse at Brithdir Mawr today. But as Abigail Neal reports, he was persuaded otherwise.
It all began so peacefully. As the deadline for demolition loomed, sofas and other household items were taken out of the roundhouse. But nearby Newport, protesters had other plans. They had one message for Tony Wrench: don't demolish the house.
We're asking you not to follow that law, because your house is too important to us, and it's too important to the movement, the ecological movement, and all the rest of the people that live on the land. It's a symbol to all of us, and we're asking you not to take it down.
And they brought other news. Protesters had also occupied Castell Henllys, an Iron Age hill fort in the national park.
I just love the irony of it. I mean, the Castell Henllys was built by somebody 2,000 years ago in the open countryside in defiance of all planning regulations. It was given planning permission by the park for their own roundhouse. I mean, you know, it's just so ironic, isn't it?
Brithdir Mawr was only discovered by the authorities in 1998 after a pilot spotted the glare of one of the solar panels. Since then, the national park has repeatedly turned down retrospective planning permission for the site. In January, 4 of the community were fined £1,000 for failing to demolish the roundhouse. Today was supposed to be the final chapter, but as the protesters got their way and the demolition was called off, its future is still hanging in the balance.
A memorial service has been held in America for a former British soldier from Bridgend who was killed.
Trying to stop the demolition of an eco-house in Pembrokeshire have spent a second day inside the building. Tony Wrench, who's involved in a planning row, had been due to demolish his roundhouse at Brithdir Mawr yesterday. He was persuaded to postpone it when protesters moved in. Swimming now, and David Davis has qualified for the Olympics in Athens this summer.
Protesters who've taken over an eco-house in Pembrokeshire say they'll stay there until tonight in a last-ditch attempt to stop it being demolished. The squatters say the roundhouse at Brithdir Mawr near Newport should be allowed to stand, but Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority want it pulled down because it was built without planning permission. Now, while most of us have been...
Our other main news of the evening, protesters are refusing to move from the headquarters of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park Authority in their fight to save an eco-friendly house from demolition. More than 100 campaigners marched through Haverfordwest, demanding that the turf-covered home should be allowed to stay in Brithdir Mawr near Newport. Well, let's go live now to Haverfordwest and join our chief reporter, Penny Roberts. Penny.
Sarah, thanks very much. Well, as you can see behind me, the protesters have now pitched camp in the Park Authority car park. Now, these tents are called yurts. They're made out of sticks. They're covered with tarpaulin, plenty of blankets inside, lots of food, lots of wood. They could be here for the long haul. Now, it's the latest move in an escalating campaign. The protesters saying they're not going to budge until the authority changes its mind. They're passionate about their cause. This, they say, is not just about the roundhouse, but a campaign for affordable housing that doesn't destroy the environment. Leading the march was Tony Wrench, who built his home back in 1997 without planning permission. And with him, supporters who share his ideals and way of life, many from similar communities in the rest of Britain.
We've been down to Bristol Mawr. I think it's wrong that they're pulling that house down. It's wrong. I mean, it's not doing any harm to anybody. You can hardly see it, and I feel passionately about it.
This has been going on for years. We've had hundreds of letters of support, masses of people support us. It's lovely, fantastic.
As they marched through Haverfordwest, traffic ground to a halt as bemused locals looked on. Throughout, the police kept a careful watch, monitoring the protest progress with their own cameras. And this is the house at the centre of the dispute, a turf-covered home at the Brithdir Mawr community near Newport. The Park Authority has demanded its demolition since it became aware of it in 1998, when a spotter plane saw the sun glinting off its solar panels. Tony Wrench was on the point of giving up, but at the weekend decided to fight on, buoyed by supporters who occupied the eco-friendly house, saying other authorities turned a blind eye to similar developments.
They can be allowed in areas where normal housing wouldn't be. They're acceptable. There are very few complaints, if any, about Tony Wrench's house. The only complaints are that he's in conflict with the policy. But we think the policy is in conflict with common sense.
Today, their campaign moved up a gear. At the Park Authority's headquarters, they wanted to speak to Catherine Milner, the planning officer. She offered to meet a delegation, an offer turned down by the protesters who wanted her to come outside and talk. The stalemate continued. By then, makeshift roundhouses had been built in the car park. But by late afternoon, Tony Wrench had had enough.
I'm still waiting for a reply from Catherine Milner since about mid-February, in fact, for a letter I sent to her saying I was going to take the house down and could we leave some of the plants. And I still haven't had a reply from that even. So I'm used to this kind of treatment, quite honestly, and I'm totally depressed by it.
We asked the Park Authority for an interview, but they declined, saying that while they were happy to receive comments on policies, the issue had been debated for several years, and the roundhouse had been the subject of 2 unsuccessful appeals before independent planning inspectors. Ironically, the authority is moving towards allowing so-called low-impact housing in the park, which protesters say would allow eco-friendly homes to be built.
We all know there's a housing crisis in Britain. Hundreds and thousands of people can't afford to buy houses. What about our children? What are they going to do? Something has to change.
Any relaxation will be too late for Tony Wrench's roundhouse, but the protesters aren't giving up. They've pitched camp in the authority's car park and say they'll stay there until there's a change of heart. Well, I'm joined now inside this makeshift roundhouse by Brendan Bull, who's one of the protesters. We saw in my report, Brendan, that Tony Wrench has had enough. He's gone home for the day. What would you say to critics who say that this is just rent a crowd?
It would be quite nice if someone was paying us. Unfortunately, the reality is that many of the people here on this protest tonight find themselves in the same situation as Tony, and they're supporting him because they don't want to lose their own homes.
Now, the Park Authority says this issue of the roundhouse has been discussed many, many times in the past, gone to 2 unsuccessful planning appeals before an independent inspector. What do you think you're going to achieve by this?
Well, it's interesting they talk about discussion. They wouldn't come out today and discuss it with us in front of the public and in front of the press. We're basically staying here tonight in the hope that they'll come out tomorrow and will perhaps reveal themselves from their ivory towers, because frankly their approach to this situation today has been symptomatic of their whole approach, which has been thoroughly high-handed.
Do you think they're operating double standards here?
Well, when you look at something like the Bluestones development, which is partly in the national park and consists of 350 prefabricated holiday lets, the massive environmental impact potential that has, as against one man with one house built out of local materials that they didn't even know was there for a year until someone spotted it in a microlight. It seems like massively double standards to me.
So briefly, Brendan, you could be here for the long haul?
Well, it's a fluid situation. It rather depends on their attitude if they want to behave like representatives of a democratic organisation rather than in the high-handed way they have done so far.
Brendan Bull, thank you. Now back to you, Sarah, in the studio.
Penny in Haverfordwest, thank you. Coming up...
First, a man has vowed to stay put in his eco-friendly roundhouse in Pembrokeshire, even though he's been fined £400 at Swansea Crown Court. Tony Wrench refused to demolish the building at Brithdir Mawr after Pembrokeshire National Park Authority refused retrospective planning permission.
I feel quite good, actually, yeah. I feel the judge didn't want to do the park's dirty work, and he more or less said so in so many words, and he heard what we had to say. He appreciated that we weren't trying to exploit any situation by being in the house, that we do it because we care about the environment. So, in all those ways, I feel that, yeah, we're exonerated. I'm very, very relieved because he could have really clobbered us, you know. So.
Tony Wrench on his roundhouse. Drivers are not getting the